Hey there folks, the number one fucked up fan from the Infinite Jukebox here with another albums, plural, review, and today I wanted to talk about the new fucked up albums, Who's Got the Time and a Half, and Another Day. We got a two-fer review for once. Canada's Fucked Up are one of the most consistently boundary-pushing hardcore bands to come out of the 21st century so far, and that really is saying something. And whether you love their unique niche that they have carved out for themselves or hate it, there's at the very least no denying that they are a consistent band across the board. As someone who has heard all of their mainline studio albums to date, I don't necessarily think that there's a specific point that you could call out as being a lowlight or anything of the sort. While I do have my personal favorite albums, I generally speaking will say that they've never put out a weak or outright bad record. That being said, last year's One Day was definitely not their best album overall, despite being a solid release, which is why it felt kind of shaky overall that they were putting out two full-length studio albums in a very short period of time this year in 2024. And now here we are with those two albums, Who's Got the Time and a Half and Another Day, both of which are surprisingly good, actually. Firstly, Who's Got the Time and a Half was the first studio album released by Fucked Up in a 48-hour period, and I find this record really interesting because I almost feel obligated to review it from an entirely different perspective compared to how I normally review records on this channel. I mean, obviously with talking about an album, an entire review is centered around the album itself, with their rarely being focused on how the album was made, but it does feel extremely important to note here that Who's Got the Time and a Half was recorded over the course of a 24-hour live stream, and in that sense I feel this record is that much more impressive in turn. That isn't to say that this album isn't good in its own right. It obviously is, otherwise I wouldn't be praising it right now. I mean, as a fucked up album on its own, it isn't very different from their other material, but as an appreciator of the fuzzed out post-hardcore sound that the band have been working with for what seems like forever at this point, I can definitely say that this is a very enjoyable record just in general. I don't think that the consistent sound they've been working with on this record is a bad thing at all. I think it's very nice to see them continue to, for the most part, kill it with a pretty singular idea, generally speaking, with some songs like On the East Side featuring some outstanding vocal performances from frontman Damian Abraham, especially when you consider that these vocal takes were recorded with very limited opportunity for reworkings or general multiple takes for the sake of, again, condensing the recording of this album down to a single 24-hour period. And I also really like some of the more power pop-ish influences on a couple of tracks here, like What's New Mary Lou. Generally speaking, I think that this is just, in general, a really good fucked up album. However, it does kind of feel like the very brief time period as well as the very public presence of this album's recording kind of gives it a bit of a boost in terms of feeling impressive. This isn't just a good album by a good band, it's a good album made by a good band that absolutely pushed themselves in terms of how quickly they could produce a quality record, and the results show. And to be totally honest, I'm not saying that you will be blown away by this, no matter what perspective you're approaching it from. If you are a pre-existing post-hardcore fan, if you're specifically a fan of Fucked Up as a band and their past work, or even if you are a total outsider to the band or the genres that they work within, I don't necessarily think that anyone approaching from any of those perspectives will find themselves especially enamored with this record to the point that they will cite it as their favorite album of the year, their favorite post-hardcore album of all time, anything like that. But I really do feel like the history behind this record and the efforts that went into the creation of it make it feel all that much more impressive. I feel that there are very few bands active today, and even fewer bands that have been around as long as Fucked Up have that are still active today, they'll be capable of making a record as good as Who's Got the Time and a Half, while also placing these extreme constraints upon themselves, while also doing it in a very public setting with a live stream, one that I tuned into at various points throughout its overall runtime. I digress. No matter how you end up approaching this record or how high your expectations are, generally speaking, I don't think it's that difficult to appreciate how well crafted, how cohesive this album ultimately ends up being as a listening experience, especially when you consider the methods of creation that went into the general recording of this record. It's extremely impressive in that regard, and it's even more impressive that the album itself just so happens to be a good record. Obviously, listening to this record will be significantly more difficult to do now than it was a handful of days ago, because the entire purpose of this record was for it to only be uploaded to Bandcamp for a 24-hour period after its initial recording, a time period which has now since come to pass. However, if you were capable and able to listen to this album in that very brief time period where it was available to the public officially, then I very much hope that you did. It is a record worth listening to. It's an album that manages to feel like the same old fucked up that you know, while at the same time managing to create something very new for them conceptually, and as a whole, I think it's just a very solid album. I'm going to give this record 3.5 stars out of 5. Who's Got the Time and a Half was officially released on August 7th of this year, 2024, and 2 days later, on August 9th, Another Day was released, the second fucked up album that we have gotten in 2024, and despite the fact that this record doesn't have any sort of special context behind it in the way that its predecessor does, I still feel like this is a really strong record, and certainly a slight improvement over its semi-sister album One Day from last year. If you listen to One Day, or really a number of more recent fucked up albums, you will probably know what to expect going into Another Day, a very noisy and dense style of post-hardcore that is really heavily placing emphasis on fuzz and a general sort of dense, thick, sonic kind of atmosphere, and if that's your thing, then this is absolutely an album that will appeal to you in the same way that it does to me. As generally speaking, this record doesn't really reinvent what Fucked Up have been doing for years at this point or anything like that, but considering this band is as good at that sound as they are, I don't necessarily think I could consider that a real terrible thing. Look, I do think that criticisms of maybe this record not necessarily being the most original thing in the world, feeling like at times a rinse and repeat of the past couple of records that the band have put out, those are totally valid, and they are correct almost in an objective sense. But in the same way that every Ramones or AC/DC album up to a point is pretty much fine despite sounding almost exactly like the last one, I think that Fucked Up are very much capable of replicating a sound that they've toyed with in the past, while at the same time allowing this new record, Another Day, to feel like an album that is entirely its own thing and unique from the records that come before it, despite sharing, again, a lot of sonic qualities with them. A lot of the peaks of the record come fairly early on with tracks like Tell Yourself You Will, Stimming, and Paternal Instinct, yet at the same time the entire record, all 10 tracks across the board, are pretty consistent generally speaking, none of them coming across as weak points or anything like that, and it feels really nice hearing the band just continue to hone in on this very indie rock kind of oriented sound that they've been going for, again, a few albums at this point. It's nice to see them contribute to developing those melodies a little bit more. Damian Abraham finding his place in the midst of all the noise as a vocalist even more, contributing to the sonic textures of the record while at the same time standing as a personality all on his own, with some really solid guitar work generally speaking throughout this entire record, and a decent rhythm section as well. As a whole, Another Day is a record that won't blow you away or anything in the same way that Who's Got the Time, I feel, would also not really blow you away, but at the same time, I don't think that's a bad thing. It's just a matter of whether or not very fuzzy, indie, hardcore, post-hardcore rock kind of stuff appeals to you as the listener, and if that kind of vibe is something that clicks with you or not. And as for myself, it definitely is something that I personally find myself enjoying, even if it is in the context of album after album of that pretty singular sound overall. So yeah, I won't lie to you and say that Another Day is Fucked Up's best album overall, and I also won't say it's a total reinvention of their sound or anything like that, and it doesn't trump some of their best moments, records like David Comes to Life and The Chemistry of Common Life. However, as a whole, I think it's a solid record. I think it's about on par with the previously mentioned One Day from last year, and while I did state that that album is among their weaker records, that is still testament to how strong this band's overall discography is, considering I think that album has some great tracks on it and is not bad by any means whatsoever. And I think as a sister album to One Day, Another Day is right alongside it in terms of quality, in terms of consistency, and of course in terms of sound. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. So, overall, while I do find Who's Got the Time and a Half to be a little more impressive just based around the context in which it was recorded, both Who's Got the Time and a Half and Another Day are solid releases from Fucked Up as a band, and I will say I'm shocked that both are as good as they are, considering I was pretty unsure of them putting out two full-length studio albums back-to-back within the same year, but I enjoy being proven wrong in those kind of situations, and I absolutely was here, with the band continuing their streak of never putting out anything less than really, really solid. And with that being said, that is the end of this album's review. Thank you for watching The Infinite Jukebox, and I'll see you in the next one.